The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to RDA's Tech Talk. Today's topic will be Identity Federation. And RDA's Tech Talk series is designed to be a 30-minute technical presentation around a current technical topic. And for today's talk, we will have about 25 minutes of presentation and then open it up for questions at the end. So before I turn it over to our presenter, I'd like to cover just a few things. You'll be able to send your questions at any time using the GoToWebinar Q&A interface on your control panel, and we'll cover as many questions as we can at the end. For questions that we're not able to address today, we will post a response in our Tech Talk LinkedIn group. So if you haven't signed up for that, we will share a link at the end of today's presentation. And we will also use this group to provide access to speakers, post-conference for session questions, as well as sharing out other materials. We will also be recording today's session, just so that you are aware. And at the end of the presentation, when you exit a GoToWebinar, a survey window is going to pop up with just a few questions that will help us enhance your experience for next time. So if you could take a moment to respond, we would greatly appreciate it. And to thank you, we'll pick 2 lucky survey responders to receive a $15 Papa John's gift certificate for helping us out. So now for the moment that you've all been waiting for, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Steve Stefanovich. And Steve has spent more than 15 years with RDA as a developer and principal architect, focusing on custom application development using Microsoft.NET and SharePoint technologies. He has designed and built numerous collaboration and enterprise search solutions for clients in the education, management consulting, real estate, law, and banking industries. So Steve, thanks so much for joining us today, and I will now turn the presentation over to you.
Great, thank you, Patty. Good morning, or I guess afternoon, everyone, depending on what time zone you're in. So today we are going to talk about Identity Federation. And this will be, kind of an overview primer on the topic. So what we'll talk about is why you should care about Identity Federation and SSO, which is related, as we'll see. We'll go over some of the terminology that you're going to hear when you see, marketing materials or read technical papers about the topic of Identity Federation. And then we'll talk about, what federation providers and identity providers are and what they do and how they work together. We'll talk a little bit about some of the enabling technologies because it's important to at least have heard some of these terms to understand where they kind of fit into this puzzle. And then once we have that kind of clear picture, we'll talk about what the business case is then for federated identity. I think it'll probably be pretty clear. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the products and categories that will enable you to use federated identity and how you can decide kind of what approach makes sense for you and your business. And then time permitting, I can talk about a couple use cases, that I've personally been involved in terms of federated identity. So let's start with the problem. If you look at kind of the application landscape today, right, at most organizations, your main identity provider is something like Active Directory, right? It's responsible for authentication of users. And the problem with that approach is something like AD, it was designed to function within a single organization, right? It wasn't really designed to support external users. While it's possible to support external users, it feels kind of yucky, right? And your AD administrators, it's not really something they're going to be interested in doing. It's hard to maintain external users in your AD. And it's hard to connect external, organizations into your AD to allow them to authenticate into your applications. So then what we look at is alternate solutions, right? So adding something like forms authentication to one of our line of business applications to allow external users access. And the problem with that is, it adds complexity, right? You have another authentication mechanism. It adds management overhead because now we're worried about I forgot my password, I got to reset my password. Just the fact that we're even storing passwords, even if they're encrypted, is kind of scary, right? That you have a database somewhere where you're storing this information. From a user perspective, I don't want to have multiple sets of credentials, right? I don't want to have my RDA login and have my bug tracking system login for whatever client I'm working for today, and my time entry for whatever other client I'm working for. It's just a lot of credentials to remember, and it puts a lot of onus on me as the user. And kind of tangentially related is the fact that users don't want to have to enter their credentials multiple times, right? I don't want to have to log into 6 different systems just because they can't figure out how to talk to one another. So the solution to these problems is identity federation. And in short, what it does is it allows one identity to be used across multiple security domains. So I, as a user, have one login, and I can use that login at systems, at several different companies in several different security domains. From a system perspective, right, I can now accept credentials that were not authenticated on the target system, right? This is kind of a key thing, right? I don't have to be in the business of authentication anymore. Because honestly, that's the hard thing, right? Storing passwords, handling that security. I want to be in the business as a developer of authorization. I can handle that, right? Tell me who you are and I'll tell you what you can do. But I would rather let someone smarter than me figure out how to deal with authentication. From a user perspective, right, now I have one set of credentials I have to remember. I only have to potentially enter those one time if I'm in an SSO scenario. And I can use that information across a lot of different systems. And so while SSO is a separate topic, you'll often see it combined with identity federation because you get some kind of cross benefits between the two. So going a little deeper, before we talk more about identity federation, it's important to understand some of the terminology because the terminology can be confusing. You'll sometimes see different terms used for the same thing. You'll see the same term used in different ways depending on the technology. So just some basic terminology. When I talk about a principal, that's any entity that can be authenticated. So a user, right, in the typical scenario. And a token is just a container for that authentication information. Right? So it could be XML, it could be binary, it could be some other format, it's a cookie, it's whatever. But a token is just the container for that information. And the token, contains what are known as claims, or sometimes assertions. And these are just general pieces of information about the principal, right? You are John Smith, you belong to the administrators group, right? Your account expires on this date. So basic information about the user. Then an identity provider, and sometimes you'll see it abbreviated 2 different ways. You'll see IDP or IP. This is just the system that maintains the identity information and provides tokens. So for instance, Active Directory is an identity provider, ADFS. Your Google logon, Google Connect is identity provider. And the applications that utilize these identity providers are service providers or relying parties. You'll see either term used. But these are your applications, right? These are things like SharePoint, your line of business apps, whatever. Anything that provides services to a principal and depends on an identity provider. So then a federation provider, and we'll see a diagram of this a little later that kind of puts it in perspective. But basically, a federation provider is just an intermediary, right? It sits between a service provider and one or more identity providers. So the idea here is, again, this decoupling, right? So your application, your service provider, is decoupled from any one specific identity provider. So I don't care anymore if this login came from Google or it came from Active Directory or it came from some other place, right? Because I'm only talking to my federation provider. And my federation provider then does all the hard work. And finally, an STS, and this is a security token service. And this is any system that builds and assigns tokens, right? So SharePoint has one built in. Any login system is going to give you a token. So how do federation providers and identity providers fit together? Well, identity providers are ultimately responsible for the act of authentication. So validating that you are who you claim to be. You are John Smith. The problem comes in is that different identity providers may issue different information and use different token formats. So for instance, when you log into Google, your token may only contain your email address. When you log into some other system, it may have information about what groups you belong to, or what your birthday is, or your full name, things like that. If your application is going to use multiple identity providers, then it has to understand all of them, right? So it has to be able to understand all the different token formats, and it also has to be able to deal with differing sets of claims that may or may not be in those various tokens, right? So you can see it quickly becomes complicated, and it quickly becomes difficult to manage. Different identity providers may use different protocols, right? There's OpenID, there's SAML, Kerberos. So again, you don't want your application to have to understand all these different protocols, right? So what a federation provider does is it sits between your application and the identity provider. Again, your application only needs to trust the identity provider, federation provider, sorry, and the federation provider then translates those tokens from the identity provider into a common format, right? So basically, you can accept tokens from Yahoo, from Google, from Active Directory. It doesn't matter because the federation provider is going to turn those all into one common format, and your application only needs to understand that common format. The other advantage here is you can now add additional identity providers without changing your application, right? Because as long as the federation provider understands the format, that's all you care about, because it's going to, again, translate it into something your application understands. So there's a whole technology soup that you'll see when you start digging into what the various federation providers do and do not support. And so it makes sense just to kind of understand what those things are, what they mean, and what we're talking about here. So the ones you'll see most often as you look at the products are SAML, OAuth, OpenID, and WSFederation. So just by way of a quick primer, and to also get rid of some of the confusion around these, I just wanted to touch on each one briefly because some of them define different things, so it gets very confusing. So let's start with SAML. SAML is kind of the most confusing one, at least to me, because it defines protocols, bindings, and a token format. So it's kind of the full picture, right? So it defines what the protocol looks like, right? What needs to be present in every request and every response. It also defines the bindings, e.g. the workflow. So how am I going to send the request to you? Where does the, how does it come back as a cookie? What do I do with that request? And finally, it defines a token format, which is going to be, all your claims in XML inside the format. So claims are represented as assertions. We saw before that sometimes you'll see the word assertions, sometimes you'll see the word claims. And where it gets confusing is other implementations will often use the SAML token format, but not the protocol or the binding. So when you'll see, this supports SAML, it may only support a subset of SAML. And to add even more confusion to the picture, right, there are other token formats, right? There's JSON web tokens, simple web tokens. So you can use SAML the protocol and SAML the binding, but maybe not SAML the token format. So it just is helpful to understand what that means. So WSFederation, again, it defines a transport mechanism for security tokens. It's meant to cover both SOAP clients, right, so web services and things like HTTP, but it uses SAML-based tokens. So this is an example of one of the protocols that uses SAML-based tokens. So OpenID, another example, you'll see that a lot when you read about these products. HTTP-based, the tokens are not XML-based. It's purely an authentication protocol. So basically its only job is can you please tell them that I am Steve Stefanovich? Yes. Here's a token that says you're Steve Stefanovich. You know, here's a certified letter that you can give to them that says you're Steve Stefanovich. And then your application basically has to trust that that token is usable. And then there's OAuth. Now OAuth is a little different in concept because it's designed to allow service providers to access resources on your behalf, right? So a good example of that is letting someone post, letting an application post something to your Facebook wall, right? So you're issued, there's an OAuth token that is issued on your behalf, right, that this application then presents to Facebook, and Facebook says, okay, this application is allowed to act on behalf of Steve Stefanovich and do something. But what the OAuth token is not saying is, I am Steve Stefanovich, right? So that's kind of a key difference. So this is just a diagram that I thought put this pretty succinctly, and I think this is from Wikipedia. So it kind of explains the difference between OpenID and OAuth. And so if you look at the OpenID, right, the application is going to ask, who are you, right? Prove it to me, right? So you will go to some identity provider, let's say Google, and say, hi, I'm Steve Stefanovich. Can you please give me a certified letter that says that? And then you get the letter, the token, right, and you hand it back to the application. And the application says, okay, this came from Google. I trust them. I will trust the claims that are in this token. So great. OAuth is a little different in concept, right? It's like the application saying, yes, give me the valet key to your house, right? So I don't care so much that you are who you say you are. I care that you're going to give me access to something on your behalf. So again, you'll go to an identity provider and say, hi, this is me. Can you please give me a valet key, a token, right? And the token then is passed back to the app, and the app now has limited access, right, to act on your behalf. So it's an important difference. And again, it's not that, you know, we need to be experts in how all these protocols work. It's just that as you look at these products, the materials are going to reference things like SAML and OAuth and OpenID. So it's good to have at least, you know, some high-level understanding of how they work. So here's kind of the, you know, the money picture, right? So where in this process does this whole idea of a federated identity provider fit in? Okay, so if we look at the flow here, right, as a user in my browser, I'm going to go log into some kind of identity provider, right? And you can see there's a whole bunch here, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, right? And I'm going to get back a token. All right, great, but now I've got a Facebook token, and this application I want to talk to doesn't know what a Facebook token is. It doesn't speak Facebook, right? So that Facebook token is then going to get it sent to my federation provider. So in this case, it's Windows Azure Active Directory Access Control, or Azure ACS, right? Azure ACS is going to apply a bunch of rules to that token, right, and turn it into an access control token, right, a standard token, which I can then pass to this line of business application because it speaks AC tokens. It doesn't speak Facebook or Microsoft or Google tokens. So you can see the identity provider is the intermediary sitting in the middle there, handling, you know, translating these tokens. It's not handling, right, authentication. The identity provider is handling that. All ACS is doing is translating that token and those claims into some standard format. So, I mean, having said all that, I think the business case for this becomes pretty clear, right? We're abstracting away the details of all these different identity providers and protocols that are out there. We're giving ourselves the flexibility to add new identity providers, right? We're managing all this in one place, right? If I have 10 different apps that need to support, you know, this kind of authentication, all I do is change the identity provider. I'm not going to have to touch all 10 of these applications. And this one, the big one for me, is offloading storage of sensitive password information, right? So I'm getting my line of business apps, my AD, whatever, out of the business of managing these users, storing their passwords, password resets, you know, tracking failed login attempts, things like that. all that gets pushed to the identity providers, and it becomes not my problem. So the security footprint of my app is greatly reduced. So great. What kind of products can we use to solve these problems? And what I did was I kind of took a look at what was out there, and I kind of broke it up into 3 categories. Right? So software as a service. These are really applications that are focused on handling authentication for any application, right, including other vendors. So you have an on-premise app and you want me to handle federated identity for you, great. I'm up there in the cloud, all you have to do is hook up to me. They can transform different token types into a single format, which is really what I care about. And they're generally backed up by some kind of SSO product, right? So ACS, Azure Access Control Services, is backed up by Active Directory Federated Services. Ping1 is backed up by Ping Federate, right? And in general, they have some kind of RESTful API, right, that I can call from a custom application. So that's kind of software as a service. And then there's what I've termed, well, I didn't invent the term, but I put them in this category, platform as a service, right? They provide token transformation in the cloud, but they're really intended to be used for other cloud offerings from the same vendor. So a good example of this is like something like Amazon, right, AWS. They have a federated identity solution, but it's really meant to allow your users to use federated identity to access other AWS services, right? So its main focus is not you have some on-prem application that you want to use to talk to it. And then there's on-premises, right? So these are things like Ping Identity, where you're going to install it within your organization and set it up and connect SharePoint or your custom apps or whatever you want to it. So here's kind of a breakdown of some of the, there are a lot of players in this market, but some of the key players, just to highlight them. So from a software as a service perspective, obviously Windows Azure, so Azure Access Control Services, Ping1, those are the 2 I'm most familiar with. From a platform as a service focused, again, you'll see Azure here because while Azure can be connected to from your external applications, it can also be used, right, to control access to other Azure-based services. Something like Amazon AWS, right? Very focused on accessing other Amazon services. Same with the Google Federated Identity solution. It's more focused on other Google products than using those identities. And then on-premises, so Windows Server, right? Something like ADFS, and then Ping Identity. So just an overview of solutions for solving those problems. So what that leads to then is that you have a lot of configuration options, right, for trying to solve these problems, right? You could do something like a pure cloud play where you're using Azure ACS and your custom app is hosted in an Azure instance and you're using Office 365 for SharePoint or something like that. So everything's cloud. The total opposite of that would be something where everything is on premises. So maybe you're running Ping Federate and you're running SharePoint on premises, and you're using that to give external users access. Then another way we've seen this done is a hybrid solution. So something like access control services in Azure and your own homegrown ASP.NET MVC application running on premises. And then the other thing that I just threw on this slide was this whole idea of synchronization. Especially for Azure, you're going to see that come into play. So you could have your local AD accounts synchronizing up to Azure ADFS, and then Azure Access Control Services sitting in front of that. And so that'll allow you to use Google or Yahoo accounts for external users and AD accounts for internal users. But still only have everything hooked up to access control services. So there's some convenience to be had there if you can get all the moving pieces kind of working together. So finally, how do we kind of choose the right solution here? So it really depends on the long-term direction of your organization. Are you externally exposing apps? Are you working with business partners? How do you want to control the accounts? Who's going to control the accounts, right? Do you need to sync AD? What kind of custom apps do you have, right? Do you need one login across all systems? Then you need to look at something that's going to give you SSO. Do you need logins from multiple sources going to your applications? Then you need identity federation. Maybe everything's internal, in which case you don't care and you can do nothing. So I can talk about the simple use cases for anyone who's interested and wants to hang on, but it looks like we are running short on time, so I don't know, Patty, if you want to, are there any questions?
Thanks, Steve. We do have one or two questions that we can go through, and then maybe we can use the LinkedIn group for the sample use cases, or if people want to hang on. I'll
Sure.
just go ahead and ask at least one of the questions. So which of these is the easiest to get up and running for a POC effort?
So if I had to pick, it would definitely be Azure ACS. I mean, you could literally, within an hour have a simple, ASP.MVC app or SharePoint web app on-prem using Azure ACS for authentication with like Google accounts is one we've whipped up for customers quickly.
All right, and just one other question. Can I use any of these technologies with my existing SharePoint installation?
Yes, and some of the sample use cases talk about that. So we have customers who are using Azure ACS and Ping Federate with,
All right.
Basically an extended web app in SharePoint.
Well, that is all the questions that we have in so far.
I can talk about the use cases for
Okay.
anyone who's interested and wants to hang out. Sure. I got so enamored with the sound of my own voice, I just kept talking to you. So three use cases that I've personally been involved with. So the first is a banking customer. It's an extranet scenario. Very cool. So SharePoint 2013, externally facing, Office web apps hosting Excel spreadsheets, which in turn host apps for Office using the new apps for Office model, which, if anyone doesn't know, is basically a website that's in the task pane of Excel. And so all of this then uses accounts that are managed in Ping Federate to enable both SSO and federated identities, so across the whole suite. So very cool. Real estate customer extranet. So again, SharePoint 2013, this is all on premises, this one, so Ping Federate and SharePoint 2013. Users are managed in Ping Federate, and SharePoint 2013 uses it for authentication. And then the last one, which I think really has a lot of value for anyone doing custom app dev. This was a customer who was a software as a service provider, so it was an ASP.NET MVC app, obviously externally exposed. And they had been doing just basically forms authentication. And so what we proofed was getting them out of that business of managing the usernames and passwords and moving all that into Azure ACS. So Azure ACS in the cloud, ASP.NET MVC on premises but externally facing for them, and giving customers then the ability to manage their own passwords and all that good stuff, and not have a big old database of encrypted passwords, sitting there on their SQL server. So real quick, just to three cool scenarios. There are some resources here. The one I recommend most is the first one. It's a couple hundred-page, book about how an internal team at Microsoft took a custom app all the way from, forms-based auth into kind of this Azure ACS ADFS world. But a lot of the kind of concepts apply across technology. And then, there you go.
Yeah, and Steve, we did have one more question come in. So that is real quick. Do you have any recommendations for an organization that needs to authenticate one group to SQL and one to Active Directory?
So that's a good question. So you can put ACS in front of either of those. but you can't run ACS on premises. You might be able to solve that with something like ping federate though. So let ping federate handle talking to either of those sources. I'll have to look into that one. That's a good question.
SQL and one. Okay. All right. Well, I think that is all the time that we have. So we'll take a look into that question, and I've written down the asker, so we'll take care of that. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. We hoped everybody learned a little something to take away. And our next presentation is going to be Wednesday, October 22nd at noon, when we are presenting SharePoint for internet sites. So if you haven't signed up already, please check that out. And this completes our session for today. So appreciate you attending, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.